By the middle of April 1944, British and Japanese soldiers were fighting from opposite sides of a tennis court in the hills of northeast India. The court belonged to the bungalow of Charles Pawsey, the British Deputy Commissioner at Kohima. Before the war reached the town, it had been part of a quiet garden. Now trenches had been dug along its edges, and the distance between the two sides was short enough for grenades to be thrown directly across it. The struggle over that small piece of ground was part of a much larger Japanese offensive. A month earlier, the Japanese 15th Army had begun Operation U-Go, an attempt to cross from Burma into India and destroy the Allied forces around Imphal. The plan was ambitious, but its purpose was clear. Imphal held troops, supply depots, airfields, and road connections that supported Allied operations in the region. If the Japanese could take it, they could disrupt British power in northeast India and place further pressure on the supply system that helped keep China in the war. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, commander of the Japanese 15th Army, believed the offensive could achieve more than a local victory. Japan had been losing ground elsewhere, while the campaign in Burma had settled into a costly struggle. Mutaguchi argued that a rapid advance into India might reverse that position. He also expected the invasion to encourage resistance against British colonial rule. That expectation was never a reliable basis for military planning, but it formed part of the argument used to support the operation. The immediate problem was geography. Between the Japanese positions in Burma and the Allied bases in India stood steep hills, dense forest, narrow tracks, and rivers that became harder to cross as the weather changed. Moving infantry through this terrain was possible. Keeping several divisions supplied, there was far more difficult. Food, ammunition, medical stores, and artillery shells had to travel along routes that were poorly suited to heavy traffic. British commanders understood the terrain, but they drew the wrong conclusion from it. Many assumed that the Japanese could not move a large force through the Naga Hills quickly enough to threaten Kohima. A raid, or a limited advance, seemed possible. The arrival of an entire division appeared much less likely. That assessment delayed the concentration of troops in the town and led to repeated changes in deployment at the moment when a stable defense was most needed. Kohima itself was not a major city or a prepared fortress. It was an administrative settlement built along a narrow ridge, roughly 5,000 feet above sea level. Its importance came from the road that passed through it. To the northwest lay Dimapur, the main railhead and supply base for the Allied armies in the area. To the south lay Imphal. The road between them passed through Kohima, which meant that whoever controlled the ridge could threaten the movement of food, ammunition, reinforcements, and medical supplies. For the Japanese plan to work, that road had to be cut. Mutaguchi assigned the task to the 31st Division under Lieutenant General Kotoku Sataititi, was ordered to lead roughly 15,000 men through the hills, seize Kohima, and block the route from Dimapur to Imphal. Once the road was closed, the Allied forces farther south would face growing pressure on their supplies. Two other Japanese divisions were moving toward Imphal from the south and east. Satai's advance from the north was intended to isolate the battlefield, prevent reinforcement from Dimapur, and help turn the fighting around Imphal into a siege rather than a conventional defense. The movement of the 31st Division surprised the defenders. Japanese troops crossed terrain that British planners had considered too difficult for a force of that size, though the march placed severe strain on their own supply arrangements. Reports of their advance reached Allied headquarters, but the response remained uncertain. Units were moved toward Kohima, redirected toward Dimapur, and then ordered back again. Officers responsible for the town could not be sure which troops would still be present when the attack began. By the first days of April, the issue was no longer whether the Japanese could reach Kohima. They were already approaching the ridge. The remaining question was whether the defenders could assemble before the road was cut. The defenders had very little time to answer that question. Kohima had never been prepared for a major siege, and its geography made hurried defense difficult. The town stretched along a narrow ridge rather than across open ground. Administrative buildings, supply areas, the hospital, scattered houses, and military positions occupied separate rises, linked by tracks and sections of road. Steep slopes fell away on either side, while thick vegetation limited visibility beyond the immediate ground. At the center of the ridge stood Garrison Hill. Nearby was the bungalow of Charles Pawsey, the British Deputy Commissioner, with terraced gardens and a tennis court behind the house. Other positions lay around Jail Hill, Detail Hill, and the hospital. None of them had been designed as permanent fortifications. Trenches were dug quickly, often by hand, and there was little wire available to slow an infantry assault. Colonel Hugh Richards was responsible for organizing the defense, but the force available to him changed almost from day to day. Units arrived, received new orders, and were sent elsewhere before the Japanese threat had been properly understood. Dimapur had to be protected because it contained the railhead and major supply installations. Kohima had to be held because the road to Imphal passed through it. There were not enough troops immediately available to cover both places with confidence. The most important reinforcement reached Kohima on the 4th of April. The 4th Battalion, Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment, arrived under Lieutenant Colonel John Laverty. The battalion brought fewer than 500 officers and men, and the rest of its brigade was unable to enter the town before the Japanese closed the road. The West Kents therefore became the trained core of a much more mixed garrison. Around them were detachments from Indian and local units, including men from the Assam Regiment and Assam Rifles, a company from the 4th Battalion, 7th Rajput Regiment, and soldiers of the Shear Regiment from the Royal Nepalese Army. Convalescents from the hospital, supply personnel, and other rear troops were also given defensive duties. Some had combat experience, others had been recovering from illness or working behind the front. The total number inside the defended area was greater than 1,500, but not everyone could be used as an infantryman. Roughly 1,500 were considered capable of taking part in the fighting. The garrison was British, led, but it was not made up entirely of British soldiers, and many of the men holding the ridge belonged to units from India, Assam, and Nepal. Pawsey was a civilian official, yet his position in Kohima also had military value. He had spent many years working in the Naga Hills and had established relationships with the surrounding communities. He was advised to leave before the Japanese arrived, but he remained. His decision helped reassure local people who had seen British units moving back and forth and feared that the area was being abandoned. Naga villagers later carried messages, guided troops along tracks, reported Japanese movement, and helped move wounded men away from exposed positions. Their work did not remove the danger facing the garrison, but it gave the defenders access to local knowledge that an arriving military unit could not have developed in a few days. By the evening of the 5th of April, Japanese troops were in position around the ridge. Mortar and artillery fire began to fall on the defended area, followed by infantry attacks against the outer posts. The Japanese 31st Division had more men than it could deploy at once on the narrow ground, so its commanders searched for weak points and tried to force their way between separated positions. The defenders relied on rifles, Bren guns, mortars, and the limited cover they had been able to prepare. Communications were already difficult. Shellfire cut telephone lines, and runners or signal personnel had to restore contact between headquarters and the forward positions. Once a section lost communication, Richards could no longer be certain whether it was still holding, short of ammunition, or already under attack from another direction. The first assaults did not break the garrison, but the Japanese began taking ground around the edges of the ridge. Each lost position gave them a better view of the remaining perimeter and reduced the space available to the defenders. Men who had begun the battle in separate localities were gradually drawn closer to Garrison Hill and the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow. The garrison had survived the opening attacks. It had also lost the freedom to decide where the next part of the battle would take place. As the perimeter contracted, the defense became easier to coordinate in one sense and harder to sustain in another. The men were closer together, but there was less room for medical stations, ammunition storage, rest, or movement between positions. Japanese observers could also see more of the remaining ground, and every lost slope gave their mortars and machine guns a better angle on the ridge. The water situation became one of the most immediate problems. Some of the garrison's normal sources had been lost or could no longer be reached safely. What remained had to be rationed among men who were fighting, carrying ammunition, repairing trenches, and helping the wounded. Medical personnel worked with limited supplies while casualties accumulated in ground that was already crowded. The wounded were difficult to move. Tracks between positions were exposed to snipers and shellfire, and there were few places on the ridge that could be considered safe. Men who might otherwise have been evacuated remained close to the fighting because the road was blocked. Hospital and supply personnel inside the perimeter were therefore caught in the same siege as the infantry. The garrison's most important support came from outside the encirclement. British and Indian artillery positioned near Jotsoma, west of Kohima, could fire onto Japanese approaches around the ridge. Observers inside the perimeter identified targets and passed corrections back to the guns. This prevented the Japanese from concentrating freely before an assault and allowed the defenders to strike positions beyond the reach of their own small arms. That support depended on communication. Telephone cables were repeatedly cut by shellfire, forcing signal personnel to repair them under dangerous conditions. When the lines failed, commanders had to rely on runners or incomplete reports. A broken cable could mean that artillery arrived late, or that headquarters did not know a section had nearly exhausted its ammunition. Japanese attacks often came after dark. Mortars and artillery struck the ridge before infantry advanced toward selected points. The defenders could not assume that an attack against one position was the main effort. A smaller action elsewhere might be intended to draw men and ammunition away from the real objective. The repeated night fighting left little chance for proper sleep. During daylight, the garrison repaired trenches, redistributed ammunition, treated casualties, and improved whatever cover remained. Snipers restricted movement across open ground. By evening, men who had spent the day rebuilding their positions had to prepare for another attack. One of the best known actions of the siege involved Lance Corporal John Harmon of the Royal West Kents. A Japanese machine gun position close to the British line was causing casualties and limiting movement. Harmon went forward, attacked it with a grenade, and returned with the captured weapon. On the following day, he advanced again against another group of Japanese soldiers. He was hit while returning to his own line and later died of his wounds. Harmon received a posthumous Victoria Cross. His action took place within a battle that increasingly depended on very short distances. The Japanese had pushed through the Deputy Commissioner's gardens and reached the area around the bungalow. The tennis court behind the house now marked the space between opposing trenches. The Japanese held one end of the court while the defenders occupied the other. Grenades could be thrown directly across it. Machine gun and rifle fire covered the open surface, making movement above ground extremely dangerous. Attempts to improve a trench or move ammunition could draw immediate fire. The court mattered because it lay within the remaining defensive area around Garrison Hill. If the Japanese broke through there, they could divide positions already compressed into a narrow section of ridge. The Japanese still held a major advantage in total numbers, but the terrain prevented them from applying all of that strength at once. Attacking troops had to move along steep approaches and through restricted gaps already covered by defensive fire. British artillery from outside the perimeter added another obstacle. The defenders were not winning back lost ground. Their success was measured more narrowly. A position remained in their hands after an attack. A damaged line was repaired, or ammunition reached a trench before it was needed. These small results did not improve conditions inside the perimeter, but they prevented the defense from collapsing. By the 17th of April, the garrison had been reduced by casualties, exhaustion, and lack of water. Japanese positions were close, and the remaining ground offered little protection from continued bombardment. Relief forces were approaching from the west, yet the men inside the perimeter could not see how far they had advanced. From the ridge, the situation still looked much as it had the day before: damaged trenches, limited water, and Japanese soldiers holding ground only a short distance away. On the 18th of April, troops advancing from Dimapur made contact with the defenders at Kohima. Japanese detachments blocked the approaches, and British and Indian units had to clear positions west of the ridge before entering the defended area. Their arrival ended the garrison's complete isolation, though not the fighting around Kohima. Japanese troops still occupied much of the surrounding high ground, including positions close to the bungalow and tennis court. The exhausted defenders could now be supplied and gradually replaced, but fresh units still had to recover the ridge through fighting that continued for several weeks. For the men inside the perimeter, relief brought the first practical change in nearly 2 weeks. Wounded soldiers could be moved out. Water and ammunition no longer depended entirely on what remained within the defensive area. Units that had held damaged trenches through repeated attacks were withdrawn when circumstances allowed. The siege had not been won by the garrison alone. Artillery near Jotsoma had prevented the Japanese from assembling without interference, while troops moving from Dimapur forced SAT to consider the western approaches as well as the ridge. These advantages became more important as Japanese supplies declined. The 31st Division had crossed the Naga Hills with limited stocks. Its supply routes ran through steep country that could not support the regular movement of enough food, ammunition, and medical material for a prolonged battle. As the operation continued, Japanese soldiers received less food, while disease and exhaustion reduced the force available for combat. Sati expected additional supplies, but they did not arrive in the quantities his division required. Mutaguchi continued to demand offensive action after conditions behind the front had changed. Their dispute grew as Sat had reported that his men could no longer continue without food and ammunition. This did not mean the Japanese attacks had been weak. The 31st Division had crossed difficult terrain, surrounded Kohima, and forced the defenders into a small perimeter. Its failure came from the gap between its mission and the support available to complete it. Capturing Kohima quickly might have cut the road to Imphal. Once the battle became prolonged, the hills that had concealed the Japanese advance made the division difficult to sustain. The defenders faced severe shortages of their own, but they remained connected to a larger Allied system. Guns outside the perimeter could reach Japanese positions. Reinforcements were moving toward the ridge, and supplies could be brought forward from Dimapur even while the road remained contested. The 31st Division had no comparable reserve close behind it. By the end of May, Sata decided that remaining near Kohima would destroy what was left of his command. He withdrew despite orders to continue. The retreat did not end the wider battle immediately, but it removed the northern arm of the Japanese attempt to isolate Imphal. The garrison at Kohima did not destroy 15,000 Japanese soldiers by itself, and the relief of the ridge was not the end of the campaign. Its achievement was more specific. Roughly 1,500 fighting men had prevented a Japanese division from taking the road junction quickly enough for Operation U go to succeed as planned. The defense included troops from Britain, India, Assam, and Nepal, together with medical and supply personnel who had not expected to fight as infantry. Naga civilians carried information and casualties through dangerous terrain. Their work belonged to the defense itself, rather than to a separate part of the story. Todade, the cemetery on Garrison Hill, occupies ground where the perimeter once stood. The outline of the old tennis court remains visible among the graves, marking the place where a campaign involving several divisions narrowed to a short distance between opposing trenches. For nearly 2 weeks, the defenders held until relief reached them. In doing so, they denied the Japanese the quick victory their wider plan required. If you value carefully researched accounts of overlooked battles, subscribe and share in the comments which campaign you would like to see examined next.